Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With renewed war in Gaza and Yemen and instability spreading across the entire region, what are President Trump's true goals in the Middle East? Let's get to the bottom line. So much for the No New Wars campaign promises of President Donald Trump. Now the United States finds itself at war with Yemen, which threatened to resume its naval blockade of Israel for breaking the Gaza ceasefire. That ceasefire was put to a violent end by Israel on March 18th when it launched a bombing campaign that killed 5 mid-level Hamas leaders and hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children. U.S. officials now say they're working on a different ceasefire plan, but now Trump is beating the drums of war with Iran and threatening dire consequences unless these Yemen attacks stop. So what are America's intentions for the region? Today we're talking with Vali Nasr, professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University, and he's author of the upcoming book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. Vali, it's great to have you in studio with me today.
Thank you.
Just ask you, I think the purpose of this show today is I'm trying to understand what America wants to achieve in the Middle East, because I think to many people watching, they're not quite sure. On one hand, Donald Trump has come out and said, no new wars. We don't want to be deeply involved in these things. And yet we've just fired a barrage of missiles at Yemen, threatening Iran, and have taken all sorts of interesting postures with regard to Israel and Gaza. So just tell me what you think America is trying to achieve in the Middle East.
Well, all that's been happening in the last 2 days, 3 days is actually a major change. Israel has resumed its military campaign in Gaza. The United States has bombed Yemen and is also threatening Iran with military action. I think the United States under President Trump still is trying to find a way to get out of the Middle East. It still does not want to spend the next 4 years in wars in the Middle East, and he wants to focus on China, Russia, domestic sets of issues. But President Trump is trying to force a situation on the Middle East by using America's muscle in a way that he can get there. And that's a very, very risky gambit. So he wants to still, end the Gaza in a way that would mean the Palestinians would move somewhere else, that Israel gets the total security that he's looking for in Gaza, potentially the West Bank. He wants to finish the issue in Yemen and perhaps liquidate another one of Iran's militia's partners by force, thinking that that will do the trick. And then he's trying to bully Iran to the table, saying that if you don't come to the table, it's going to be war. And he's calculating that this kind of a strong arming the region will basically get the Middle East to where he wants it to be, which means that he can then basically move on to other things.
So I've read a lot in political science, we call it literature, but books and articles about conflict negotiations when you're trying to bring conflict to a resolution, peace, or some new equilibrium. And they often talk about both parties often try to muscle up and take military actions against each other before those negotiations. We've seen it happen many, many times in the Middle East. Donald Trump seems to be doing that, seems to be pounding these rivals in place. But who's he negotiating with? Who's on the other side?
Well, the other side is really the supreme leader in Iran, because the Gaza issue is obviously only with the Palestinians, and that's an aside. But the bigger issue in Yemen, and particularly the nuclear issue, is about Iran. What President Trump is trying to do is not that different from Barack Obama. I mean, when President Obama decided to talk to Iran, he was afraid that there was going to be a war in the Middle East. And the only reason there would be a war in the Middle East was Iran's nuclear program. So he decided that to take war off the table, he had to negotiate. I think President Trump is pretty much saying the same thing, that there's going to be...
So you're saying there's continuity between Obama and Trump?
There is, because both of them want out of the Middle East, and both of them need to deal with Iran's nuclear program in order to be able to get out of the Middle East, because that's the only reason why Israel may go into a larger war in the region is over Iran's nuclear program. Except President Trump is putting this in a much bolder, more aggressive tone, that if you don't negotiate with me, it's going to be war. The problem is that he's doing this all in public. And the more he saber rattles in this open way on tweets, on bombing Yemen, the more he actually reduces the room to maneuver for Iran's leadership. And I think they may calculate that actually they don't have the political capital to go to the table if he's doing this in such a brazen way.
So you talked about Yemen and pounding Yemen, one of Iran's last operating supported militias. How real is Iran's control over the Houthis, over Hamas, over Hezbollah, and some of these arms? Do they have any independent action, or is this entirely, as the Trump administration often casts it, that fighting the Hezbollah is fighting Iran, fighting Hamas is fighting Iran? What's your sense?
No, they're not controlled 100% by Iran. They're not a division of Iran's military. They are an independent organization which have their own vested interest in Yemen. The Houthis also have their own political sets of interests in this war. They have made their ceasefire conditional on ceasefire in Gaza. So when ceasefire in Gaza is breaking down, it's very likely that the Houthis will feel a lot of pressure, even within the Arab world, to basically stand up and do what they promised. On the other hand, Iran will find it very, very difficult to rein in the Houthis under a direct ultimatum from President Trump, and also when the Gaza war is restarting. I mean, President Trump is basically creating a situation where he wants the Iranians to admit that they have caved before his ultimatum by coming to the table. And the political cost for that may be so high that even if they want to come to the table, they may not find a way to come to the table.
You know, I was just at the Raisina Dialogue in Delhi, India, and one of the major interviews there, besides Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, who didn't say much, but the really interesting interview there was Anwar Gargash, the former Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in the UAE. And in his remarks, he really put out an olive branch for Iran, so that he was hopeful and thought there were very positive signs about the UAE being able to work with Iran. I've heard Saudis say the same thing. Is there really a new breeze going on out there, despite the bluster we're hearing from the White House about Iran in this moment?
I think so, in the sense that the White House really doesn't want war. This is not 2003 Iraq. This administration really doesn't want war. The president is putting all this bluster, but we're not seeing a military buildup in the Gulf right now. And what else is different is that UAE and Saudi Arabia don't want war in the Gulf, because you can start a war, but you don't know how it's going to end. And they are the ones who may get bloody, and their whole economic plans for technology, infrastructure, 2030 developments, etc., all of that may be jeopardized. And so they are hoping that there will be negotiations. So they're putting their most effort to get Iran to the table and the United States to the table. And Iranians also, I think, want some form of negotiation. The key is President Trump's style likely to spook the Iranians, or is it likely to persuade them to the table? Right now, it looks like that the room for the Iranians to be able to get to the table is narrowing. It's not expanding. He's not really showing olive branch to Tehran. He's not saying the right things to give them confidence to come to the table. He's actually being extremely aggressive with them, and he's creating a situation where if Iran tomorrow said, I'm coming to the table, it looks like they are coming to the table because he threatened them, and they cannot afford to be seen to be bullied to the table.
Vali, I know you think about much of the world beyond the Middle East, and I want to ask you a question that's really been confusing me. You know, on one hand, if you're hanging out with European leaders, which I've also been talking to, there's an incredible confidence crisis right now about their relationship with the United States, about their fundamental core security, and there's this sense they have that America is kicking down its own hill, that it's walking away from all of the elements and infrastructure of its own global power. The only person that doesn't seem to have a confidence crisis about the United States is Israeli Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu. And I think in that arrangement, is there another side of this story down the road where America is all of a sudden, perceived to be a weaker and less significant power? That it doesn't mean a weak power, but a weaker power that doesn't have all of the instruments it once did. Where does that leave Israel at that moment?
Well, it's not good for Israel if the United States actually loses its footing. If even things happen domestically or in Europe or in other theaters where the United States loses focus on the Middle East or is not willing or capable of supporting Israel. But to your point, if you're Iran, you would basically look at this picture and say things are going sideways in Europe. The president has put a big bet on peace in Ukraine, and it's not clear whether that will deliver. And then there's so much happening domestically and on the trade front, they may very well say, let's wait. that right now we're still in a honeymoon. Maybe 6 months from now, the U.S.'s hand will look very different. And if the U.S.'s hand looks very different, you're right. Then the balance between Iran and Israel will look different. Can the United States and Israel really focus on Iran in the way that they are saying, if Gaza falls apart, if other things in the Arab world fall apart because of Gaza, if Europe falls apart? I mean, this whole thing between Iran and the United States is not happening in a vacuum. And Iranians are very conscious of that there's a lot of things this president has put in play that if they all come to fruition, of course, his hand is going to be enormously stronger. But a number of them can go wrong in the next 5-6 months, which then can change the context in which this talk of negotiations is happening.
Look, I mean, I'm maybe overstating this for a minute, but man, I imagine if President Trump had a choice between spending a weekend with, European Community President Ursula von der Leyen or Russian President Vladimir Putin, he would pick Putin. He said, I want to hang out with him, and do things with him. Vladimir Putin and Russia have a very good relationship with Iran. So is that another element here that as we see a shift, at least what looks to me like a shift, of something that wants to be an embrace of Russia, which is shocking a lot of people, does Iran become part of that package?
Possibly. I actually think this is more strategic than personal, the way media puts it. I don't know if the president actually would enjoy spending time with Putin, but he has a sort of a view that to isolate China, you need to bring Russia in the direction of the United States. You need to break the relationship with China. He obviously doesn't put much value in Europe in this calculation. And then, ultimately, you want to also bring Iran along as well. I think where there's a problem is that the Iranians are not interested in working through Russia with the United States. They don't trust the Russians. Just because you have good relations with someone doesn't mean that they actually necessarily believe that the Russians would be the honest brokers here, that Russia will not cut a deal with Israel and the United States that would sell the Iranians. So going through the Russians is actually not as productive as going through UAE is. Iran much rather go down that route. And I think the Iranians understand that if they get to the table, it has to be United States and Iran. And that formula that worked in 2015, 2018 of having a group of world powers negotiate with Iran is no longer feasible. The Europeans don't want to work with the Russians. The Americans don't want to work with Chinese. The Iranians don't want to be left alone in the room with just the Europeans and the Americans. So in the end, they need somebody to convene, which could be UAE or Saudi Arabia. And then basically they need to deal with the United States directly. And I think just the philosophy of how you get to the table is different. Iranians want to be shown respect and to be seen to be coming to the table on their own terms, not being bullied. Whereas President Trump thinks that he's on a hurry, he wants the deal in 2 months, which is not necessarily doable, and that he's going to bully Iran to the table. And it's the style that may actually cause the collapse of this thing rather than the willingness of the two sides to have a deal.
I don't know, when I think about this pot that seems to be getting hotter and hotter with all the things in it. You've got Syria that has shifted from being a kind of pro-Shia state to now a very pro-Sunni state. You've got what looks like a rapprochement between the Druze and the Israelis. You've got a lot of moving pieces, moving in ways never expected before. What's your gut? Is there any chance of stability coming out of this? Or do you think it's more likely that we're going to see another cataclysm, a real set of misjudgments, miscalculations, and serious war?
I think more likely we'll see a cataclysm because I don't see in the United States and Israel a vision for...
I just want you to say that again, as I want my hearing.
I think there's going to be trouble.
You say it so calmly that I...
No, there is going to be cataclysm because I think that the United States and Israel are not looking to establish a sort of a regional order that is acceptable to the region itself and they would be inclusive of their viewpoints. They want to assert a victor's dictate on the region. And Israel in particular sees itself as having won in the Gaza war in an absolute term. So it wants to establish an absolute sort of hegemonic position on security issues around the region. And that opens the door to all kinds of resistance coming down the road. That puts the stability of many Arab countries, Jordan, Egypt, etc., on the line. Saudis, UAE, Qatar, the Gulf countries are extremely nervous. The Arab public is very angry. they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel where there would be a situation in which it would be acceptable to them. And then you have Iran, which is basically waiting in the wings and could benefit from this kind of an instability. So the United States in particular is playing a very high-wire game, assuming that it can dictate peace to the Middle East rather than establish peace in the Middle East. These are two different things.
When it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship, who's driving that vehicle? Because I remember in the past when you and I discussed the JCPOA and we discussed some of the rationale behind that, Iran's behaviors and concerns, Israel is also pretty good at making strategic choices that confine U.S. options. Do you believe that Israel could confine U.S. options again and could make a strategic choice that Donald Trump may not want made?
I mean, it certainly can. It has the capability to do so. It can change facts on the ground, which would then force the United States to react to it. It has the ability to influence the foreign policy debate in the United States in important ways. But ironically, I think President Trump has shown greater willingness, at least, to basically assert his own view or the view he sees for the United States than the Biden administration was. I mean, there would probably not have been a Gaza ceasefire had it not been for President Trump. It's very clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't like the ceasefire to begin with, doesn't like it now, wants a whole new sort of a process to happen in Gaza, and that's why the war has resumed. And there would not have been a ceasefire in Lebanon or ceasefire in Gaza, I believe, had President Trump not insisted that on January 20th, when he comes in, he wants these conflicts at least to be wrapped up. And right now, the way he's bullying Iran to the table is he's putting more of a premium on talking than military, whereas Israel actually wants to just jump over any idea of talking and go for hitting Iran's nuclear program right now. And so there is, if you would, a difference in approach. President Trump really does not want a war with Iran. Israel may be willing to start an attack on Iran. But I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is seeing more difficulty pushing President Trump to follow his lead than he had pushing President Biden to follow his lead. But in the end, Israel has a thesis about where it sees things going. And the question is, does the United States in the end feel comfortable with following that lead? But only time will tell.
Well, look, and let's come back to Gaza for a moment and the this day in which the ceasefire blew up with the deaths of over 400 Palestinians, 5 mid-level Hamas leaders were killed, but huge crisis again in Gaza. And you still have Donald Trump talking about expelling 2 million people from Gaza and resettling them somewhere, while no Arab state at all has given even a millimeter of sunshine to that proposal. Where does that go?
Well, that's exactly the point I was making. There's a difference between dictating an endgame or peace for the region, and whereas actually achieving or making peace, which would involve bringing the Arab states on board and arriving at a final solution that would be inclusive of everybody's input. It would not be exactly what the Israelis want. It would not be exactly what the Arabs want, not exactly what the U.S. wants. But in the end, it would be something that all of them would be willing to support and live with. That's the definition of arriving at peace or achieving peace means. It has to be negotiated and inclusive. And then that has more resilience. Where President Trump is going, and perhaps Israel is going, is actually dictating the end game to the Arabs. There will be no more Palestinian issue in Gaza. There will be no more Palestinians in Gaza. They're going to leave, and Gaza is going to have a very different future. So they're going to try to ram this through the Arab throats, if you would. But that's dangerous because these Arab rulers also are ruling over publics that are extremely unhappy, and something can break at some point.
Vali, the other thing that's going on in the United States, in our own politics about the Palestinian issue, is that some of those involved with the summer protests at U.S. universities who have green cards, who are visiting over on visas as students, have been detained by ICE, with the notion of expelling them from the United States and suspending their rights because of what they said. I don't want to simplify this. The administration has said that they were terrorist sympathizers. That's the administration's account. Others, including academics and many Jewish intellectuals today around there, very, very worried that speech is being curtailed in a way that we haven't seen in the United States in many years. You're at a university that deals with the Middle East. Is there now a damper over the kinds of discussions like we're having around the region, with fear that people can't speak one way or another, or even protest, which has been part of university culture, for as long as I can remember?
The simplest way of putting it is that we're in a period of tremendous uncertainty. In other words, not only because there is a clampdown on hate speech, on anti-Semitism, on protest, but literally the boundaries of what constitutes these things is not very, very clear. So universities are also grappling with defining these things. In other words, what is it that constitutes unacceptable speech? How do you deal with it? But so all of that creates
but isn't speech protected whether it's unacceptable or not? I mean, this is a really interesting question, right? We have a guarantee of free speech you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. We know that. That's what the Supreme... But virtually all other forms of speech have been guaranteed. Are we finding a major rollback, even as you discuss it and say what is appropriate speech and what's not, from a university perspective? That's almost chilling.
Well, I can't speak for universities, and some of the issues that you're raising are really sort of constitutional sets of issues, which I'm not comfortable commenting on as an expert. But the reality is that what I can say is that students, faculty, even university administrators are dealing with a situation of uncertainty. In other words, because boundary lines even if we exceed that boundary lines are shifting, it's not clear where they're shifting to, how they're shifting to, what subjects are included, et cetera. So this is sort of a kind of a negotiation of what constitutes what is, as you say, free speech, what is hate speech, is being negotiated in real time, but not in a room by a group of congressmen, lawyers, et cetera. It's just happening on an ongoing situation in the public domain, if you would. And so it's creating a lot of anxiety, uncertainty in terms of ultimately where does the line ultimately get defined.
Just finally, Vali, you see cataclysm coming?
I mean, first of all is that we have I think both sides want to avert getting into a much worse situation, war, total sanction of Iran's economy. So I think stopping the sort of train wreck that that could be a major war in the region is what Saudis want, what UAE wants, what Qatar wants, what I think Iran wants, and I think what the administration wants. Where do you go beyond that is really depends on whether the deal survives. Like
right.
If the previous nuclear deal had survived, we don't know where we would have been today. So Iran and the United States have a massive gap of trust between them, and that needs to be built first by a deal that they can make and then can keep.
Fascinating. Well, I really appreciate your candor today. Vali Nasr, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University, thank you so much, and we wish you very well with your forthcoming book release.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. So what's the bottom line? The temperature is rising again throughout the region, with the U.S. bombing Yemen and threatening Iran as Israel resumes the killing in Gaza. And Syria is still an open question. The trend we're seeing under the Trump White House is contracting U.S. power, punctuated by bursts of action. This is Trump's transaction-driven foreign policy. Israel is in good standing right now with Washington. The Arab Gulf states are mostly in good standing. Now that Iran has even been knocked back, they even might be able to find a way to get into good standing. But the Palestinians and virtually the rest of the region have zero standing. So throw out all of what you think you used to know about the power politics in the Middle East. Everything has to be rethought. U.S. power is going to be erratic and impulsive, forcing all countries to eventually seek out balancers and hedges against the United States. And that's the bottom line.